Hello, I'm Dr. Jane McCartney. I'm a consultant psychologist in the UK, and having been fascinated by human behaviour for a very long time, I find myself particularly fascinated by crime and what could be going through the thoughts of various murderers and criminals. In this episode of the Psychology of Crime videos, I wanted to look at Charles Manson. Obviously, there's been huge amounts written about him and films made, but I particularly wanted to look at his crimes together, a background about him, his crimes, his personality factors, and then potentially what some of his thoughts may have been. Now, obviously, this is just me speculating based on many years of clinical experience, but just to give you an idea of potentially what he was thinking at certain events to do with his crimes. So Manson was born in early 30s, I think it was. He died in 2017 and he was about 80 or so when he died. And it's interesting that the last few pictures of him, he has a swastika tattooed on his forehead. Easy to do, I guess, in a lot of prisons. But yeah, and he's still sending that message, and he's still knowing that that picture is going to go worldwide, because those would have been some of his motivations. But I'm going to come on to those a little bit later. So obviously he murdered many people, or was certainly instrumental in the murder of a lot of people. He organised it, he engineered it. He was brought up by a reasonably neglectful mother. From an early age, he would have understood, if not certainly wouldn't have welcomed it, but he would have understood what it was to be rejected, what it was to be put second, third, fourth best, but certainly not first best in his mother's life. He was a petty criminal from a very young age, and he would spend 20 or so years in and out of prison. And apparently when he was really young and he'd gone to a reform school, he'd asked if he could come back. He was kind of, finding the error of his ways, and could he come back? But his mother wouldn't have this. And when he's finally released from one particular stretch, he goes to, this is 1967, and he goes to San Francisco. And of course, 1967, San Francisco was the whole kind of hippie and, tune in, drop out kind of era, which obviously would be very, very attractive to the likes of Manson. But I think what would have happened reasonably quickly, and, imagine it's attracting thousands and thousands of people, that area, in that time. And I think what would have happened was, like him, there'd be a certain section that just didn't quite fit in. They didn't quite fit into the whole laissez-faire, leave us alone, we won't bother you if you don't bother us type of attitude that was going on there. There was something more edgy, and there was something more pent up with these people. And the younger ones seemingly would have been drawn to him, and there were upward of 100 at one point in the so-called Manson family, and they have no or little life experience. Perhaps they're runaways, perhaps they're homeless, but they don't have enough life experience to know that this is a potentially dangerous man. So they're drawn to him, and he's kind of accepting this and liking this, and there's a certain acceptance himself, which is something that he's clearly been looking for all of his life. If we think about his past formative experiences, he's looking for some kind of acceptance, that he's not going to be rejected, he's not going to be thought of negatively, he's not going to be abandoned. And he's liking that. And of course, the more he liked it, the bigger his ego and the wilder his protestations may have been, calling himself the second coming at one point, the more they thought that he was their leader, all the archetypal bits of a cult. And it's interesting that he wanted to start a race war. And obviously we know which way his particular allegiance was going, with the swastika on his forehead. But he was talking about wanting to start a race war. And he would say things like, right, once this race war is over, it's going to be beholden to us as this kind of superior being to tell the winners of the race war how to act, because they're not going to be familiar with being in charge or having all this authority, and it's up to us to do that. And then he would then justify his killings by saying, but we have to start the ball rolling, and let's start the ball rolling in such a way that the whole world is going to take notice, because that's what he was after. He was after some bizarre Armageddon between the entire world, that he would be the one that would be on top. And that's his madness and his narcissism and his psychopathy all coming out, but being encouraged by these young kids and these vulnerable, but going along with it, children that he's got around him. And, they weren't all children, they were adults as well, but they were easily influenced. So he would go along, he would, gruesomely orchestrate the murder of Sharon Tate and her friends that were at the apartment that night. And then the following day, he would go to a very, very well-known and very wealthy couple, Labianca, and he would be part of that. He would be part of their killing, because seemingly, when it was reported back to him what had happened at the Tate household, he would call that sloppy. The most awful and dreadful things had happened that night. And he was always going to say that there was always going to be a criticism, because he was looking for justification for going out and killing again the following day. There were many murders and assaults attributed to him. So let's have a look at his personality. I'm going to use the 5-factor model, a well-known model for personality, and it looks at the 5 big personality traits. And if we think about this with the acronym of OCEAN, so it's open to new experiences, conscientiousness, extrovertism, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Now, open to new experiences, he scores very highly on that, because he was constantly trying to try new things, be it drugs, be it forming your own cult, be it stealing, being anything. He was constantly trying to have new experiences, because he wanted the new, he wanted the stimulus of the new, whether it was legal or not, which 9 times out of 10 with him it wasn't. It didn't really matter. It was thrilling to him. He was sensation seeking. Conscientiousness, obviously very low. He had no empathy for anybody or anything that was going on. And extrovertism, it's kind of like a medium, because given his right situation, or what he thought was the right situation for him, yes, he would be very extrovert. He would be able to stand up in front of people and tell them what to do and what's going to happen in the future. Same with agreeableness. In the right circumstances, it may sound a bit bizarre to say Charles Manson was agreeable. Of course he wasn't to society, but to certain people he could be agreeable to. And his neuroticism, which is, his neediness, his confidence, his fears about what's going on, his awkwardness, that would be very high. He would score very highly on that. And if we just have a think about what he potentially was thinking himself when the crimes and the events were happening. So it's a bit of a bizarre one, but I want to go back to what motivated him. And seemingly it was about, he wanted fame. He'd auditioned a few times when he was in Hollywood, apparently. He'd been to Dennis Wilson of the Beach Boys fame house and had stayed over, and there was something about he'd written a song that Brian Wilson had then subsequently recorded. But all the time he was being rejected. He was, his music wasn't good enough, his auditions weren't good enough, or his readings or whatever it was he did. It wasn't good enough, which would have just pumped that narcissistic ego up even further every time he was rejected. And that, to him, would have been, right, this is just like when I was a child. I'm not good enough. I've given you my best. It's not good enough. Therefore, that makes my self-worth and my self-importance reduced. And, that's the neuroticism showing itself, the personality trait of the neuroticism showing itself. So when his thoughts about when he was orchestrating the killings at the Tate house would have been, it was revenge. It was revenge on the showbiz world, because, she's high profile, and Roman Polanski obviously wasn't there at the time, but she's high profile. And he wanted to take his revenge and, enact all the wrongs that he feels himself on the showbiz world. And he had to do it in a really public way, even though it did take some time for them to actually find him. But the show trial and everything that would go on. And lastly, his thoughts about himself in prison, the trial and in prison, would have been his notoriety. He's got one thing, which is these gruesome, awful murders and his cult. which is all combined. He's got this one thing, and boy, is he going to keep that in the public eye as much as possible. Hence the photograph of him in his latter years, and his, I think there were marriages, I'm not too sure, but there were certainly high profile things that would happen, or more to the point, newsworthy and noteworthy things that would happen that would keep him in the public eye for the most awful reasons, but it would keep him in the public eye, which is what he wanted, because therefore he is somebody. He's not that no one, that little boy that he slides into every so often when there's a slight or a perceived rejection about something. He's not that little. He turns into that little boy, and that's why he has to keep his profile and his notoriety up. So those are my thoughts about Charles Manson. Please feel free to put some comments below. Always read them, and don't forget to subscribe, and that would be really great. So until next Psychology of Crime, thanks ever so much for watching. Keep safe, and I will speak to you soon.